Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world tuning into this little viewing. My name is Daniel Davis Wood. I am the commissioning editor at Splice, and I am in conversation today with Anna MacDonald, the author of most recently A Jealous Tide. She's in Melbourne. I am in Scotland. Anna, good evening to you.
Good morning to you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Early morning, yeah.
Very.
Yeah.
Anna MacDonald is a literary critic and essayist. She's written for the Australian Book Review, the Sydney Review of Books, and others. Most recently, she has written the introduction, a very fine introduction to the republication of Beverly Farmer's A Body of Water from Giramondo. She's also a novelist and the author of two books from Splice, both of which have been published in about the last year. So her first book, Between the Word and the World, appeared in October 2019. It's a collection of what I think of as writings on reading literature and trying to assimilate literature, not its meaning, but the felt experience of having read it, to assimilate that into one's outlook on and disposition towards a world that is constantly in flux and unable to be pinned down. And her second book has just been published. This is only a few weeks old. It's a work of fiction called A Jealous Tide. And I have here before me some of the very enviable accolades that it has received from its early readers. Lisa Hill of the ANZ Lit Lovers blog called it an exquisite short novel. It reads like the work of a writer at the top of her game after spending many years perfecting her craft. A clear candidate for my annual best books of the year. Declan Fry, writing in Kill Your Darlings, compared it to the work of Maggie Nelson and Gina Apostol and described it as haunting and glittering with lapidary detail. And Fiona Wright in the Saturday paper said that the writing is rhythmic and exacting in its details, and she called it a compelling and unsettling book, and one that is both beautifully ambitious and remarkably assured. And if you scour pages online, especially Twitter, you'll find much, much more acclaim of the book of a similar kind, because it's a book that seems to have reached readers and touched something in everyday readers, as well as the critics who have praised it. So the novel takes the form of a testimony, the testimony of a nameless and restless narrator, a woman, an academic, uprooted from her home in Melbourne and displaced, somehow a little lost in London, where she's researching the works of Virginia Woolf, and more specifically, the imagery of water in Woolf's writings. This is Woolf who would eventually drown herself in a river in Sussex. And during her aimless walks through London, the narrator comes across an historical plaque on Hammersmith Bridge, which points her towards the real life story of a woman who dived into the Thames one icy evening in December 1919 in a state of distress, and the recently returned soldier who gave his life so that she would live. As the narrator insinuates herself into this historical event, imagining it and reimagining it in ever more seemingly precise detail, she becomes disoriented, increasingly disoriented, spatially and temporally, and she begins to lose her purchase on herself and her reality to some extent, in a way that makes these previous drownings of Woolf and the woman and the man seem foreboding, like portents of her own possible fate. We will be discussing primarily A Jealous Tide, but also both books, and writing essays in addition to fiction, just so that viewers know what to expect. Anna and I are going to discuss the book. Throughout the discussion, Anna's going to give three brief readings from the novel. One of those was a section that we agreed on together. One is a section that I asked Anna to read, a section of my choice, and one was entirely her choice. And so we'll thread our discussion around those three readings and wrap up at the end with some pre-submitted, pre-selected questions from readers out there in the world. To begin, Anna, you're going to read just a brief passage from Between the Word and the World, so I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you for having me. and for anyone who's watching this evening or whatever time you happen to tune in. This comes from the opening pages of Between the Word and the World. I've always been a walker, never a bookish child. I wanted to be in the world instead. I still thought of the word and the world as irreconcilably separate then. Walking was a way of going places, to the park, down the creek, onto the street, alone or with other children. This was a time before the fear of public spaces, before organised and micromanaged play. As a teenager, walking helped to solve a restlessness I didn't fully understand, less a way of going than an attempt at being still. It became a shortcut to solitude, a space to think teenage things. Later still, walking became a means of discovery, a way of deviating from the paths beaten by collective habits of movement and mind, those routes overwritten by family, friends, school. Now an adult, walking has become many things. It is a way of going places. It can be uncomfortable, boring, dully routine. Sometimes walking is still a way into solitude, but often I do it without thinking. What I realise now, what by walking I have come to notice, is that at some point, I can't say exactly when, walking and reading and being in the world became one for me. I read Virginia Woolf and sought to assume the walker's central oyster of perceptiveness, an enormous eye. I read Gaston Bachelard on space, on the elements, and especially on poetic reverie, that triple liaison between imagination, memory, and poetry, that form of cosmic dreaming which positions us in a world. From Woolf and Bachelard, I learned that writing is a road to dreaming the world. But from Ian Sinclair, I finally, belatedly learned to see how the worlds dreamed on and beyond the page bleed into one another. Writing and reading are first and always ways of being in the world. They are ways of looking and seeing and feeling and thinking, of experiencing the world in all its dimensions. Writing and reading are ways of looking and seeing and experiencing again.
Thank you, Anna. I love that because that seems to me to be quite key to your work in both books, is the inextricability of reading and writing and being in movement, as particularly walking. And it also kind of blurs the lines between the autobiographical and the fictional early on, and does a nice job of having the novel, A Jealous Tide, sort of contained in the first book. So just sticking with that first book, you include a few chapters there on the work of Olivia Laing, which initially appeared in a slightly different form in the Sydney Review of Books. And I mention that because that was the first time that I ever became aware that you had, at some stage, been working on a work of fiction that would become A Jealous Tide. It wasn't called that at the time. I just want to quote you back to yourself, if that's okay, from that chapter on Laing. You write, I first came across Laing's work when her debut, To the River, was published in 2011. At that time, I was living in a village in Warwickshire, spending the mornings writing at a makeshift desk, drafting a novella in which I reimagined the attempted suicide of a woman and the accidental death of the man who jumped into the Thames to save her. 2011. Can you take us back to 2011 in Warwickshire, of all places, and the origins of this novel?
The irony isn't lost on me that when I was kind of finishing, if anything really is ever finished, what became A Jealous Tide, or the initial embodiment of it, I was in a place that's the furthest point from the sea, I think, in England. And the sea kind of haunts this book in many ways. I suppose so this book began as part of that very strange thing, PhD in creative writing. It was the creative component. At the time, so I did my PhD at Monash in Melbourne. At the time, Monash and the University of Warwick were in discussions about establishing what is now called the Monash-Warwick Alliance. And as part of those early discussions, I was fortunate to go over to meet various people, you know, at Warwick as part of a Monash team in the early phases, early stages of my PhD. And then there was a reciprocal trip of Warwick academics and students to Melbourne. And while I was there, I met many people, but Maureen Freely, who became very important to the realisation of this novel. And so even though there was no formal arrangement at that stage between Monash and Warwick, with Maureen's help, I was able to have a kind of informal visiting position at Warwick, although I based myself in a small village just outside at Stratford. And when I got there, I had most of a draft, a complete draft of the novel. I didn't have an ending, and I had a number of questions, I suppose, that I wanted to work through while I was there.
I just want to stick a pin in the ending. I'm going to come back to the ending in a little while.
Yeah.
But actually, having heard you say that now, then I think I'd like to, if we could, take a step back even further. When did you know that this was the particular work that you wanted to write? That was in Melbourne then. That was before you went to Warwick. Okay.
Yeah.
So where did it, the first inner stirrings come from?
Well, in fact, I had no intention of writing fiction. I had never written fiction before. I didn't believe I could. So I decided to do a PhD because I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship, which meant I could quit my job. I had been working as a curator for a number of years at that time, and I knew only that I wanted to spend more time reading and writing and see if anything could come of that. And I'd been reading a lot of Ian Sinclair at that time. And I knew that I wanted to write, I intended to write a kind of extended essay or a series of essays. I knew that I wanted to write about place, and about place from a position of a kind of deeply felt unsettlement, I suppose, rather than from the position of close attachment. Mm-hmm. But I had no, apart from that, I had no idea what I was going to do. So I just set myself the task of sitting down each day and writing a fragment, either from memory or from, I would just see what happened, basically. So they started as remembered fragments. I had by this stage already spent a long time around Hammersmith. It was kind of a habit of mine, I suppose, until relatively recently, until about 5 years ago, to go to London at least once a year. Mm-hmm. And I always based myself while I was there around Hammersmith, so I was very familiar with the area. And so I had at one stage all of these fragments that were in some sense a kind of examples of, you know, Bachelard's Poetics of Reverie, which I mentioned when I read the section from Between the Word and the World, that kind of triple liaison of memory, imagination, poetry, but they were clearly much more on the imaginative kind of bent than the remembered bent by this stage. And I also realised at some point that maybe they fit together.
Was that also because even at this early stage, they were involving the stories from history, the stories of this woman and the lieutenant, or not yet?
Certainly before I went to Warwick, the lieutenant and the woman were there.
Mhm.
the basic structure, the basic kind of 3 threads of the narrative were there.
Okay.
I mean, I had been during that time backwards and forwards to London too. So I had been, as part of writing down those fragments, some of those fragments were written in London, some of them were written in Melbourne.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's interesting. There's an image that comes to mind from the book where the narrator is walking along the pebble dash shore of the Thames, the River Thames, and notices people scavenging, mudlarking or kind of collecting the bladder wrack, little pieces of things that have washed up. And I'm getting a sense of this in your creative process, that you go, you look, you get a little bit here, and try to put all these fragments into something meaningful.
yeah.
I'm curious about what you said about writing place then. So if I've got it right, so you started back and forth with London to Melbourne and started piecing it together, went to Warwick to finish it. Was there a sense for you that that you had to take yourself away from the
Mm.
place you were writing about for such a large section of the book in order to get that feeling of distance rather than familiarity that you wanted? You had to actually not be there and write from memory?
I mean, I think for me, and this is one of the things, when I thought I was going to write an essay, that was a kind of driving force, I suppose, that kind of dual desire to be both, or to feel both at home and to be elsewhere always and at the same time. Because for me, and I'm certain that this is the case for a lot of people, leaving home means that my mind works in a completely different way, partly because of, I mean, geographical distance is important. It kind of helps to, I think, to also create a distance between the responsibilities of home. It doesn't feel quite so urgent to answer those emails or to make phone calls or to distract, to become distracted by other things. But also, in one sense, I kind of needed to be on the London side of the narrative. I mean, by Australian standards, Warwickshire and Wilmcote, where I was living, and London are very close to, very close together.
That's only by Australian standards.
I understand this, but for me, it felt very easy to move kind of backwards and forwards, because I mean, I think if I trained as anything, I trained as an historian, and I love archives, and for all that deliberately, and we might talk about this as a point of ethics, a lot of the research I did never ended up in the novel. It was important to me that I did the work and I did the research, and I knew as much as I could about what had been reported as happening that night in 1919. And it, I deliberately made the decision to step back from that. So archives were very important to me in terms of being in that place. And those kind of archival fragments found their way in, I mean, the sections in the Welcome and the British Library, I mean, that's basically what I do when I when
I think
I'm
I think that's yeah. As a reader of fiction, you can never say for sure, but I think that's pretty clear that those are drawn from some sense of life. But that's interesting that you say that, because if readers go on to read that Olivia Laing essay in Between the Word and the World, they'll find that actually when you were walking and reading and writing A Jealous Tide, you were not in London at all, that it was in Warwickshire, and it was the Avon Canal and other places. So even I think it's a point probably worth making for Australian readers. Even over here, you were still imagining the place that you were writing about. So I want to ask about some of the literary influences. Then you're very upfront about Ian Sinclair. for this book and for the earlier book. W.G. Sebald, Teju Cole, Olivia Lang. These are all writers who write largely about walking, or often about walking. They're quite peripatetic figures. John Berger is, I know, an influence for you. He gets the epigraph in Between the Word and the World. Edgar Allan Poe appears quite a bit in A Jealous Tide, surprisingly, to my surprise anyway. But who else? Who might readers not notice by name or quotation, would you say, was some influence on the gestation of this book? Or is everyone in there?
No, definitely not everyone is in there. And certainly someone who wasn't in there until, going to publication, I suppose, is William Fiennes, who now there's an epigraph from the Snow Geese. I read the Snow Geese when it first came out, so I would have been in my mid-20s. And I reread a lot, but that book, alongside maybe the next contender for the books I reread most, would be the prose narratives of W.G. Sebald. And I think there are a couple of ways in which the Snow Geese directly influenced A Jealous Tide. Oh, numerous ways, really, and no doubt some that I'm not even aware of. I remember, I think, Fiennes saying at one point, talking about the Snow Geese, about the importance of books that are curious about the world. And for all that A Jealous Tide is a very interior narrative, I hope that it conveys a sense of how small we are in a much larger context over which we have very little control. And there's wonder to be had there, as well as, sometimes great terror and anxiety. But I think also, and in terms of what I said earlier about that kind of desire to write about place from a position not of attachment, or uncomplicated attachment is probably a better way to think of it, but rather from a sense of kind of unsettlement. One of the things that continues to strike me when I read the Snow Geese is that sense of belonging in one place over numerous generations, which, I mean, I don't have. I suspect many white Australians don't have. And in fact, any sense of belonging must be complicated and frustrated, surely, by an awareness of the violence of dispossession and invasion. So I suppose I wanted, at the time I was kind of surprised that there wasn't, well, certainly I wasn't aware of more writing in Australia that, I'm thinking about non-fiction rather than fiction now, I suppose, but that that kind of addressed that directly. So I guess that sense of wonder at an ability to feel so at home in a place, I kind of wanted to, one way of understanding that perhaps was a way of coming at it from the opposite direction. And also that sense of, the quote at the beginning of the book talks about the tilt, the axis between the north and south on the globe. And in terms of migrating birds, this is very important in terms of their routes and so on. But for me, that's a kind of defining image, I suppose, that sense of the north and south attracting each other, but also kind of the potential for things to fall apart. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's clear. That really opens up that epigraph as well. That finds epigraph in interesting ways. from the epigraph to the very end of the novel now. This is my last question before our first reading. You alluded to not having an ending. I know that there was an ending that was changed, and that I won't say what the original ending was, but well, let's just say it was much more definitive and less open-ended than the ending that we have now.
I was very shocked by it. I hadn't intended it at all.
So okay, so well, that's kind of my question. What led you to do it? What led you to have a different ending, and what was it that persuaded you that this was not the right ending? Was it a person that persuaded you?
I don't think it spoils anything in the book as it is if I tell you that originally I killed the narrator, and I don't plan at all when I'm writing. I had no sense of where the book was going. So when I got to Warwick, one of the things I needed to do was to write an ending. And it was Maureen who very kindly broke it to me that no, actually, I don't think this ending works.
I was listening recently to Zadie Smith's interview with Michael Silverblatt from many, many years ago, about 15 years ago.
Yes.
And she was really candid about, she said, just before she'd recorded the interview, she was on a plane and she reread her book, The Autograph Man. And she said she was enjoying it until she got to a section of about 20 pages, which she read and she just knew that it was wrong and it was false to the novel. And she said, and I remembered when I wrote it that it was wrong, and I went ahead and did it anyway. And it felt like an ethical violation of my responsibilities to the artwork. Did you have any sense of anything like that while you were writing that?
I suppose it did. It felt like a cop-out, I suppose, to kill the narrator. I mean, I was thinking too of, I think it's in E.M. Forster's The Art of the Novel, where he talks about the problem with endings is that, you know, writers, for the last third of the novel, a writer has to start killing off the characters, you know, metaphorically.
Yeah.
And I feel that I perhaps took that too literally. So I think, yeah, it was during the storm that I'll, you know, read the section from in a moment. It was during the storm that that the narrator died. But I felt too perhaps that it upset the balance between the three threads of the narrative, and there were other things that upset that. It's hard to get, you know, that very fine balance. When I was, one of the other things I talked to Maureen a lot about was if I needed to give more kind of biographical detail about the narrator. You know, we know very little about her motivations, about why she is drawn to the kinds of narratives that she is, about why she moves through the world, I suppose, in the way that she does. And a real concern of mine that I haven't really lost is how much patience can I count on from the reader to just go with the story and to not need to know everything, to not, myself as a reader, I hate it when I'm given all the details. I like to fill in the gaps myself, but I know that, you know, I maybe took this to just to the edge of an extreme, you know, about how much information I withhold.
I think viewers will understand that if there's the narrator doesn't reveal a lot about herself. That's true. So if she then kills herself at the end, or if she dies at the end of the book, it probably has less impact, or doesn't entirely make sense if we don't know so much about her. But I think you brought us to a good place for the first reading. So you're going to read from the story of the woman who jumped into the Thames.
The woman walks with a shipwrecked gait. The wind whips sleet through the air, circles her shrouded body, threatens to rip her from her tiny feet, never to return her to land. I can see her bent double into the gale, clutching her thin coat to her chest beneath two tightly folded arms. She wears a hat, more from an ingrained yielding to social convention than for warmth, but it cannot protect her from the howling night. And when a fresh gust causes her to stumble, it's as if the pavement has lurched beneath her feet, as if the wind has found its way beneath a stone into the foundations until it has worked crests and deep troughs into the plane of the streets with as much ease as it would carve the fractious surface of seawater. Water wants to be agitated. It throws itself into the swell and toss, the pound and thrash, the splashback and rounding terror of wave over wave over wave. In the calm, it's only preparing itself, replenishing its fierce strength for the next surge. Not really calm then, only listening, rippling with electric energy while it waits for the hint of another rolling wave, gathering momentum, building and building until it breaks. Now it is as if that wave is tunneling beneath the city streets, as if the water has discovered a shortcut, found a way under the land, bypassed the tiresome need to negotiate a coastline and flood into the river's mouth to quench the terrible thirst at Foulness and Canvey Islands, the estuary marshes and Gravesend. Instead, the sea is washing westward direct from the channel. It is boring beneath Essex and Kent. It is gathering gravel, sand, brick earth and clay as it moves, relentless and at breakneck speed. Its muscular currents ripple with seams of sediment which it thieves from the city's foundations to leave the metropolis limp, sullen, amnesiac. And the river waits. It holds its breath, bracing against the bed, feeling the reverberations of the time-deepened sea ripple across its surface as across the drum of a listening ear. As best it can, the river steadies itself for the onslaught, when the tunnelling sea will smash through both banks at once, when it will make its bed anew with rot and rock until the glacial cut is a fresh grave in which the pebble-dashed shore, the lost treasures and trinkets, the memories of times and people past have come to rest, finally interred. And I watch the woman as she lurches onward into the stone swell. She's clutching at the buildings on her right, searching out the lee, but they bend and shift in the squall with everything else. She's gripping a door frame here, a weather-worn window ledge there, seeking to steady herself from the fall she knows must come, hoping to delay it for as long as possible. I can see her moving hand over grasping hand along the red brick facades of Hammersmith Bridge Road as she makes her way, alone, in the dark, towards the river. The woman's body is bound up in the immediate task of remaining upright, putting one foot in front of the other, keeping her eyes lowered to avoid the sleet and dust and other debris which the wind would hurl in her face to blind her if it could. So as she nears the water and makes her way down to the right towards the river's northern upstream bank, she doesn't notice the man on the bridge approaching Hammersmith from the south. She isn't concerned because she cannot see that his clothes are not storm-tossed, that his cap is firm upon his head, that the river water beneath him and in front of her is calm, that the sleet and the dust and the dead leaves that swirl through the air cling only to the worn fabric of her thin coat, to the netting of her modest hat. She cannot know that while the gale bites beneath her collar, slices between her cuffs and the fringes of her gloves, elsewhere the winter night is cold, certainly, but calm and quiet. The woman drags this squall in her wake. Well before she reaches the edge of the river, channel water is lurching beneath her unsteady feet, and despite her efforts to keep her face down, her eyes sheltered, the storm blinds her to the world around her, to the punters who are filing out of the Blue Anchor after last drinks and smoking in huddles before finally turning home, to the few lights still on in the mansions nearby, and the round bulbs that light the bridge like the edges of a fairground dance floor in summertime. When she scales the sleeper siding to reach the shore, the storm numbs her hands to its timber grain, ridge-backed, a raised tendon pulled taut under tension. It deafens her to the sound of the pebbles that rub against each other when they shift beneath her feet. The woman is caught in the centre of her squall, numbed, newly blind and deaf, unable to register subtle shifts in sensation. I watch her walk towards the river. I watch her walk right into it. She doesn't pause, doesn't flinch with the cold when the water breaches her ankle boots, the hem of her skirt, when it drags the heavy folds of her coat across her legs, causing her to stumble, vying to make her fall. She flails for a moment, but doesn't stop walking, not until the water is over her waist, working its way up the buttons of her blouse, nearing the collar of her coat. Still caught inside her swirl of sleet and debris, still bent forward against the savage wind, still clutching her coat to her chest with both arms, I watch the woman walk on into the rising water until her body is a hunched torso, then a head, then a flimsy hat skimming the surface of the river like a child's toy boat abandoned after an afternoon at play and left alone to find the way home.
Wow, thank you. I suppose I have only one question before we head into the lieutenant story, but it's a large question. This was a real woman. At the same time, this version of the woman is a reconstruction of the narrator of the novel, and at the same time, this reconstructed version is a projection of the narrator's own state of mind in the act of reimagining. At a time when there's a lot of discussion about who owns narratives, about the ethics of writing other people's stories, what were your ethical considerations in picking up this woman's tale and retelling it and using it for these purposes? How did it bedevil you?
I still feel a bit bedeviled, to be honest. I suppose it was one of the very important questions that made me kind of face the fact that I wasn't writing non-fiction, that I was in fact writing a work of the imagination. You know, I said before that I did a lot of research into what was reported at the time of the actual historical event. I also, you know, I mean, I went through census records. I followed her trail as much as I could. Not because I wanted to use any of those details. In fact, it was very important to me that none of those details, including how she ended up in the river. I mean, that description of her entering the river is not at all historically accurate. I just felt for my own kind of sense of what was right and wrong and what should be in the book and what shouldn't be, I needed to kind of have a clear sense of that. There, I suppose, and that decision kind of shaped the way that then the lieutenant became a character for me as well. I mean, on the plaque on Hammersmith Bridge, the lieutenant is named, but the woman is not. And for me, it was important to keep her unnamed. It was not as a way of writing her out of history, but as a way of respecting her privacy and the privacy of her family. And so how I came to think really of all of the woman, the lieutenant and the narrator, none of who are named apart from on the first encounter with the plaque, I came in my own mind to think of them more as kind of archetypes of, especially in terms of the lieutenant, awaiting demobilization after the First World War, and the woman. I kind of focused instead on the circumstances that might have led both of them to encounter each other in the vicinity of Hammersmith Bridge, rather than what actually, I mean, there's only so much I can know about the actual figure of the actual historical figure of the woman. I can know a bit more, I suppose, about the lieutenant. I looked at his war records and so on. But it seemed very important that they should, in some sense, not be pinned down to any one historical or two historical figures, but to represent a kind of experience that may have been shared by many people at that time in December 1919.
That's a really beautiful segue, actually, into the section from the lieutenant story that you're going to read. It's an interesting process too, that you start off very thoroughly researching an abstract from there, rather than turning to fiction because there are gaps that you haven't researched in the historical record. And so this passage kind of abstracts him as well into an archetype, I guess, of a certain type of returned soldier. This is my choice. Over to you.
One afternoon, as the light begins to die, the lieutenant opens the door onto the hallway once more. He steps out of his room, quietly descends the carpeted stairs, and stands in the doorway of the communal lounge. Nobody looks surprised to see him. The man with the newspaper is still there, sitting in the same chair, although intent this time upon the advertising columns of an illustrated weekly. Another man, new to the lieutenant, sits in a winged armchair by the fire, a book resting open on his lap, his eyes searching for something deep within the flames. Neither man looks up as the lieutenant enters. The third man, the one who had sat unseeing by the window that first day, is now gone. His seat, left empty, looks cold. The lieutenant walks to the vacant chair and sits upright from old habit. He looks out the window into the fading light and tries to reconcile this street-level view with the one he has learned from the two halves of his open window above. It isn't easy. The trunks of leafless plane trees, pillared street lamps, a postbox, all obscure his view. They break it into fragments, which he has to work hard to piece together, and each time he thinks he has completed the picture, he finds a piece missing, is forced to dismantle the whole and begin again. The light dies before he can finish, and he is left with a view of the world that throws the room behind him to the fore, plants in it the skeletal branches of plane trees given outline by the street lamps now coming alight. But instead of turning away from the window or rising to close the curtains, rather than facing into the room, attempting to speak with the other men or seeking out his landlady, asking for a cup of tea, the lieutenant sits still in his chair and strives to make sense of the new picture before him. He works methodically, focusing first on the jaundiced face in the centre of the window, not his true face, the one the night-sharpened glass returns to him. It has gouged hollows from his deep-set eyes, chiselled flesh from his cheeks, until the face is reduced to bone barely shrouded by a sallow skin. He takes that stranger's face as a cardinal point, avoiding the eyes and the slight sneer that washes over the thinning lips, and moves his gaze gradually out in ever-widening circles. From the face to the two wings of the armchair, from the armchair to the plane of the mantelpiece, which seems in reflection to retreat into the room at an odd angle, leading the eye from the corner immediately behind him to the far one diagonally opposite. That timber line splinters the lounge into pieces, recomposes it into a series of flat planes that sever the head from the man bent over his illustrated weekly, cut the paper's pictorial cover from the rest of its ghastly body. The splinter disappears the quiet man before the fire almost entirely, leaving only a drift of pipe smoke sending signals up to the ceiling. And having severed the head of the reading man and disappeared the man looking into the fire, the reflection repeoples the room with the spectral faces of another family, photographs of whom, posed singly and in groups, are spread across the mantelpiece and now find their way over the walls and ceiling onto the sofa within the fronds of the potted palm. As the lieutenant sits, intent upon the room reflected in the dark window, the ghosts of that other family turn towards the open door, peering out into the empty hall. And all the while, the long fingers of the leafless planes creep further and further into the room. They part the flames in the fireplace, send sparks like rapid fire up the chimney and emerge supple and unscathed, preparing to count off the ghosts, the reflected room's inhabitants, one by one by one. Those fingertips run through the lieutenant's hair, send a shudder down his upright spine. They hold the curtains back on either side, force the unveiled window wide. Then they move around the reflected room, heartless as a senior officer pointing to a map, giving instructions to his company to target the already weakened positions here, 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 and here. Out of habit, the lieutenant follows the pointer with both eyes, learning the map of the room according to instruction. The pointing fingers circle anti-clockwise. It counts down each descending hour with a momentary pause, coming to rest first upon the gaping hole leading into the hall, then the photograph of a young man in uniform, the empty space where the man before the fire should be, the hollowed face the room orbits, and back to the hole leading into the hall.
Wow. I love this. I love this section because I think I can see the influence of Berger and art history, particularly on this, as you have this sort of this carved, sculpted image becoming more two-dimensional and yet cubist somehow as his eyes are drawn across the pane of glass. But the real sort of influence that I wanted to ask you about in this section is the literary one. Septimus Smith, the shell-shocked soldier from Mrs. Dalloway, is name-checked in the novel. I'm assuming that there was a lot more of this type of literature or these type of characters or other influences that went into the construction of this man's psyche. Can you talk to that?
I think certainly Mrs. Dalloway and Septimus Smith were very important, and the narrator talks about, you know, looking in the Woolf archives at the British Library. There was, in terms of other changes that, you know, from earlier drafts, there was in fact a section in an earlier draft which used, which kind of quoted directly from Woolf's drafts for the hours which became Mrs. Dalloway, specifically actually her crossings out. That was was extremely eye-opening to see Woolf's drafts, and heartening in important ways. Almost no complete sentences, mostly crossed out, appalling spelling, which I was very happy to see. So there was a sense, so the kind of influence was more directly kind of influenced, I suppose, in an earlier draft of the novel. I think in that particular section, the influences I was thinking of directly were visual rather than literary, except that they were also literary because they were also, you know, Berger's early essays from the 1950s talking about cubism and talking about, I suppose, the way in which the knowledge that history has given us means that, you know, a single perspective is no longer possible, but also that attempt by Cubist painters, especially I was thinking of, to represent all facets of an object at once. So that's definitely there. In terms of modernism more generally, I mean, Eliot is obviously important to the novel too. I think I wasn't necessarily conscious of it, except that during one of my extended stays in Hammersmith, Edward Fox was reading the 4 quartets at Riverside Studios, and I went to see it about 4 times. So I guess I had that voice, and that voice in proximity to the river, very much front of mind.
Just on modernism, what's really fascinating to me about the book is that the sentence by sentence style is quite lyrical. Yeah, there's nothing, there are no sentence fragments really. There's nothing. It doesn't seem like it's been blasted apart the way Eliot's language sometimes can, and other writers, of course, of that period. But the way that the narrator's narrative is put together is, well, as you said, you don't give much information about the narrator's background, yet we do get episodes from her life, right? We get stories from you know, a near drowning, things she's encountered in museums, kind of misadventures in the mountains and things like that. But the narrative as a whole is fragmented in the sense that there's no cause and effect chain between these things. Nothing. There's like it's a description of an event that leads at something tonal or something atmospheric to what she's doing with her researchers, but not an explanation for it. So in that sense, it did seem to me to owe something to modernism and to the literature of shell shock, where it's up to the reader really to infer the causal connections between A and B. Would you say that modernism was an influence in that, in putting together that skeleton of the book?
Probably the thing that I certainly was most conscious of in a kind of in terms of an influence of modernism was more the interiority of the narrative, perhaps. But in terms of the narratives of shell shock, I mean, I actually, Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy was very important, and then I did a lot of reading around that. I read a lot of first-person accounts of soldiers during and after the First World War, a lot of accounts of the home front during and after the First World War. So
what were you finding there? Was it quite disjointed accounts? I mean, were they unable to, were they evasive, or were they quite clear about it?
The thing that you know, the thing that strikes me the most, in fact, is, and it's the same from the reading I've done from journals of Antarctic explorers, you know, during Scott's expedition immediately before, you know, and at the beginning of the First World War. The thing, in fact, that struck me the most was just the sheer kind of resilience and tenacity, and the that in the face of all of this horror, that especially in letters home, less so I suppose than in journal entries, but still in journal entries, there's a sense of a kind of hopefulness, or a kind of curiosity, you know, and love of the world and kind of things like that. So that, in fact, was was the most, I mean, the thing that actually comes back to me and that I remember most often in terms of what I read around that time, and which is unfortunately especially pertinent now, is that Australians had one of the worst records for killing prisoners of war during the First World War. Yeah, so I was actually surprised by what I found in those accounts, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay. And that is then a segue into our final reading. That's the first time we've mentioned Australia, really, since the beginning of our discussion. So it's definitely time to hear from our narrator and her situation. This was the passage that you elected to read.
At a restaurant near the station, I found a table inside and ordered. While I waited for my meal, I watched the other diners around me, a family at the large central table, the children drawing new worlds with crayon on butcher's paper, two men at the table next but one sitting opposite each other in animated discussion to nominate the first musical instrument. One insisted on the hands as clappers or as drums, the other on the human voice. Bare bulbs of varying sizes were suspended from the ceiling and lit the room like a celestial constellation by which men at sea might find their way into port. Behind me, pedestrians struck out for home, and I felt that at any moment gravity would cease to weight me to the earth, that I would lift from my seat and drift up past the constellation which lit the children and their drawings into the earth's atmosphere and beyond, out of orbit. It was as if the earth's magnetic field had flipped, as one compasses across the globe pointed suddenly south instead of north. And I felt as I might if I had been marooned on a ship at sea when the earth shifted its weight, so that my maps and my navigational aids, every coordinate I had carefully reckoned and recorded, even the nautical almanac that taught me to read my position in the movement of the stars, were rendered useless, and I was alone, without a guide, trusting my weight to the sea. While I waited for my meal to arrive, I scribbled in my notebook, trying to make sense of this strange sensation. I let thought give way to memory, memory inclined towards thoughts. First of Magwitch, returned to London during a storm that smeared the city's streets in mud, stripped lead from the roofs of tall buildings, tore trees from the earth, and carried gloomy accounts from the coast of shipwreck and of death. Magwitch, who appeared to Pip like a voyager at sea, come from the new southern world many 1,000 of miles of stormy weather away from this one, having been sea-tossed and sea-washed for months upon months. Magwitch, whose return caused Pip fully to know how wrecked he was and how the ship in which he had sailed had gone to pieces, to feel as if his last anchor were loosening its hold, to understand that he had no home anywhere and that he should soon be driving with the winds and waves. Magwitch, who knew that it was death to come north and came anyway. I remembered travellers' tales that described the narrow stone streets of the 19th century city echoing with calls of cooey as Australians out of port sought to find each other and their way in an unfamiliar place called home. And I found myself recalling an early image of the Antipodean. In it, he is hanging suspended upside down, the soles of his feet inverted and pressed against those of another upright man, the Antipodean conjured as a monstrous reflection of the upstanding northerner. And it wasn't difficult to imagine myself into the hanging body, sitting on a restaurant banquette with other diners chattering before me and pedestrians swiftly in motion behind. I felt my legs twitch and then turn. And I imagined that when I finally rose to leave, it would feel natural, if not right, to step forwards out into the street with the rest of my body swiveled back, so that I could see ahead of me a life lived in reverse, a life where the future would be experienced as a void which, if I were to keep moving ahead, I had no choice but to walk into backwards and unseeing. a life in which the present could be felt only as the varying weather on my shoulders, as a shifting breeze or the welcome warmth of the sun. A life in which eyes worked only to see what had already passed, the places already passed through, the people already passed by. My pasta arrived. I put my notebook aside and forked the food into my mouth, chewed and swallowed without tasting, hoping with it to weight myself to the earth. As I ate, I thought of the hanging man. I felt that to be out of place, to be dreamed as a reflection of the upright, meant that everything else was also reflected, also reversed, that to drown would be to suffocate in air, not water, that to experience the vertiginous pull of a geomagnetic pole would be, was, to feel the dizzying fall up into the surrounding atmosphere, away from the earth, instead of down with gravity towards it. It was the solitude I minded most. More than the loss of places I knew, more than music, even more than water, I feared the loss of other people. I feared falling out of orbit alone. As I sat at my table, watching the young children opposite me make new worlds out of crayon on paper, as I listened to the man at the table next but one clap his hands to demonstrate an early instrument, earlier even than speech, as I turned to the window behind me and saw lights come on in another building and pedestrians still afoot, falling alone up into space came to feel like riding a near-empty train into an unfamiliar night without the anchor of a silent reader sitting opposite. I paid the bill, tipped, and walked back to the station. Descending in the lift to reach the platform underground, I imagined the cut in the damp clay around and above me, the earth layer upon layer overhead. On the journey home, I pictured the world atop the tunnel, ticking off familiar landmarks as I went, recalling episodes of a life lived overground, using memory as a security against the loss of the Earth's gravitational pull. When the train called in at Earl's Court, I stood and opened a window. And between Earl's Court and Hammersmith, I sat alone in the carriage and felt the air ruffle my hair, collecting sounds and smells from the night to connect me to the world and hold me fast. When I stepped off the train at Hammersmith, I didn't think of South Yarra this time, at least not for long. Instead, as I crossed Hammersmith Broadway, I tried to look forward to turning off into the quiet of Rowan Road, to fishing the key from the bottom of my bag, inserting it in the lock, pressing down and slightly to the left to help it turn. I looked forward to closing the door behind me, dropping my bag and flicking the switch to light the room with its single central yellow star.
Well, nothing happens. A woman walks into a restaurant, eats dinner, gets on a train, goes back to where she's staying.
Yeah.
And yet it tells us everything we need to know about where she is in her own head, I think. Why did you choose this passage? What does it mean to you?
Interestingly, it's one of the ones I struggled over the most. I think when I was writing and rewriting, especially the section after the narrator's legs have switched and that sense of moving backwards, was very hard to get that experience kind of clear, to get a clear image of what that might actually be.
I can only imagine, yes. The words for that are very carefully chosen. So go on.
Yeah, so that maybe because of that, it's one of the sections that I think about most, perhaps in the novel, that probably alongside the first section I read with the woman going down to the river. And I think because it captures for me, in obviously a highly exaggerated way, the sense of being being an Australian, whatever that means, being an Australian in the Northern Hemisphere, especially perhaps being an Australian in Britain and England especially. I don't know, you'd have a sense of this as well, but I think that section also with the Magwitch kind of the quotations from Great Expectations and the figure of Magwitch as that figure who was exiled and then returned. Not that I think of myself as an exile, but you know, that sense of what it means to return, I suppose, is very difficult to capture, but a very real sense of what it. Yeah, it's like having to look at someone else's image of you, you know, that isn't an image you necessarily recognise.
Definitely, and something you can't, well, that's represented spatially here. She can't get her bearings on it. She's sort of asking herself, where am I? Who am I? Where am I? Where is this thing that I call I? Like, where is it in space? And she fixates on things outside herself to sort of say, well, I stand in relation to this thing, but then that's always moving, and she's always, so she's spinning around, right? Like in this sense that her sense of self is always sort of dragged along by circumstance. That's the exile's condition, or the returns, however you would like to put it. Yeah. And the passage seems to me quite emblematic of that experience, like almost literalizing it in a way.
Yeah, and I feel like maybe I didn't fully understand it perhaps until I started writing it down. I mean, it's only one, you know, in the same way as we need to see something from all different perspectives and to see how those different perspectives kind of work together, as in a cubist painting. This is one face of that, really, but it's a powerful face, I think.
One other thing about this passage, I don't want to put words in the narrator's mouth. There's a word that she, I think, pointedly doesn't use. But what readers have picked up on is that the narrator has some sort of traumatized history, some past behind her. Some have said melancholic. She's depressive. The word she doesn't use is bipolar. But all of her imagery, from the early magnets to the tilt of the world, the being upended, is about bipolarity. Do you I guess, do you see the flip side of it, so the depressive end of bipolarity in this book anywhere, though? Do you see joy and reverie in her?
She's not terribly cheerful. I think you know, it would be. I hadn't thought of the bipolarity of the narrative except in terms of geography, I suppose, and the way that, and physics, the way that gravity kind of works. I mean, it's amazing to me that we're these little things on a circling globe in this giant universe we barely understand, and we don't all just kind of fly off like that. This is quite astounding to me, and clearly I have no head for physics or these sorts of things, but I think there's no doubt that the narrator is, I don't know if melancholic is the word or depressive is the word. She's certainly, and this is one of the things that I was worried about in terms of the narrative, and that I tried while I was at Warwick to kind of fix. I experimented with different scenarios that might explain her state of mind or give a give more of a sense of her motivations, but none of it worked for me, and it threw everything else kind of, other things started to spin off in the wrong direction. So yeah, but in my mind, there's absolutely no doubt that I suppose I think of it as, well, we haven't really talked about a shipwrecks, because there's one of the things the narrator becomes obsessed with, accounts of shipwreck, and especially shipwrecks in which people are left adrift at sea, not knowing whether or not they'll be rescued for either short or long periods of time. And I suppose in the same way as I came to think of the three narrative threads, kind of three archetypes, I came to think of each as representing a kind of different species of wreck. Don't tell anyone, but I don't actually know what the narrator is going to
retract. I retract. Well, I said I didn't want to put the word on her, but then I did, didn't I? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I had to,
but I
put
felt,
that
you
on.
know, and I tried to work it out, but I just couldn't, you know. And I felt better after hearing John McGregor talk about one of his stories, and someone while I was at Warwick, he came and did a reading, and someone asked, oh, you know, and what happens to this character, and he didn't know. And so I thought, oh, okay, maybe
Okay. It's allowed.
If it's okay for John McGregor, it's okay for me.
Yeah. Oh, so, fair enough. That's
yeah. It's there, definitely.
It's there. So just the last question from me then, is about what is it for you to look at this novel as an Australian novel, or yourself as an Australian writer? I mean, I could see you could possibly put it in a genre of the displaced Australian in Europe, like The Riders by Tim Winton, or so, but it, you know, or Dead Europe, but it doesn't have that intensity of it's not as macho, basically, is what I'm saying. Thankfully, I'm very glad it's not as macho. So where
that
would
have
you?
Been hard.
It would have been, yeah, and a great misfire, I think, probably. So if you, where would the Anna MacDonald of Between the Word and the World, if she were to pick up a jealous tide, where would she be putting this in sort of the landscape of Australian literature? Does it sit next to for you?
That's actually a very hard question to answer, and I think it's probably important to say that there's Australian literature that is published in Australia, and then there's Australian literature that is either never published or that's written here, that is either never published or that's, you know, like this book picked up not within Australia. I don't look, it doesn't sit easily alongside a lot of fiction that's currently published in Australia, I don't think, but it does, I guess I would say maybe Jane Rawson's The Wreck. Certainly when I read that, I felt a kind of a sense of recognition, perhaps, that some of they're quite different books, but, you know, I think I feel an affinity. I think maybe with also writers who were working and being published in the 80s in Australia, Beverly Farmer among them, that sense that Australian writers don't necessarily have to talk about or focus on Australian culture or life in contemporary or Australia, or the kind of purely historical novel, I suppose. I mean, I suppose, you know, your novel, which I'm almost finished reading, I've got 50 pages to go, but again, that sense of an Australian literature that can look outwards. I mean, I suppose I don't really think of myself as an Australian writer. I don't, except when I'm overseas, I don't really think about being Australian. It's not, I prefer to focus on the local or the kind of larger view of things, and I get a bit queasy about the kind of notion of a national literature, I suppose, or anything like that.
That's kind of what I was fishing for,
Yeah.
as well as the.
I got there in the end.
You got there in the end. I was wondering. I didn't want to. Well, obviously, I didn't want to put words in your mouth, but I was wondering if that was something that you might say, and also the comparison to farmer. I mean, that seems quite evident to me, but it's hard for me to tell anyway. Being not in Australia for so long, it's hard to tell how you might see it. I have a few questions from readers. This is sort of a rapid fire round. They're pretty brief questions, and they're very much more to the point than my questions. So brace yourself.
Okay.
This comes from Becky Armfield. I'm interested in your writing on women as a woman. You often give voice to women writers in your essays, but neither of the women in your novel are named, and the woman in the historical narrative is also silenced to a large extent. Can you say something about how large the issue of gender looms in your mind when you are writing about other writers, and or versus when you are writing your own fiction? How much do you think of gender?
When I'm writing essays, unless it's you know, a concern of the writer, I suppose, it's not front of mind, except it's probably always there. But I
Not something
tend...
you seek consciously to address, unless the text does. Okay.
Yeah, no. I try always with essays to take whatever work I'm considering on its own terms, not, but also to kind of make clear my position and how I'm reading it, I suppose. And I will certainly, especially with the literature of walking, I suppose, I will have certain experiences of that, which are no doubt gendered. In terms of the woman in the in A Jealous Tide, you know, I deliberately didn't name her because I felt that was an invasion of privacy. And I guess apart from the narrator, almost nobody speaks in the novel. There's almost no dialogue. But I was very much concerned with what it meant to be a woman waiting during and after the First World War. And also, so I felt that in relation to the woman herself, who gets roughly a third of the book, but also to the figure of the landlady in the boarding house where the lieutenant goes to live. I felt very much that the experiences of women in war, especially at this time, were quite different to that of men, especially those who went to fight.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think Becky. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I'd have to go back and look at the figure of the landlady. So she's someone who I didn't pay so much attention to. The number of times I've read the novel, she's
barely there.
She's barely there, but in terms of that sort of gender thematics that you just mentioned, women waiting, she actually kind of reinforces what's going on with the other two women in the narrative. The next question is from Joshua Cope. Uh, is Jealous Tide, in your view, an example of autofiction? If so, are you happy with that label? If not, why not?
Well, I guess when I wrote it, autofiction wasn't really being talked about. There were other terms for kind of autofictional narratives. The quick answer is that the narrator is far too depressive to be an autofiction kind of version of me. But having said that, there are whole sections of the book that are drawn more or less directly from memory and personal experience. So I can't discount it completely, and I don't discount it at all. You know, I think yeah, there's certainly an autobiographical element to it. Yeah.
Would you be happy if someone said this is autofiction?
Yeah, I don't mind.
You
You
don't
know,
mind?
I think
Okay.
I think it's kind of out of my hands now. You know,
Right.
I'll try not to be too possessive. Yeah.
Some people have very strong feelings about that label these days, so you seem not to. That's okay.
Yeah.
Last question comes from Sergey Erens. The narrator uses a stack of index cards to take notes on her research. This seems completely. I have to interject here. So, Sergey, you've written this seems. You mean to write this seems completely chaotic to me, but you wrote chaotic, chaortic, which I love as a neologism. It's like the kind of chaos that gets you right in the aorta, gives you a heart attack. I think that's a brilliant turn of phrase. This seems completely chaotic to me, but it also seems very real, like something you might do in your own research, except for the fact that your prose is so calm. Do you have an orderly research process? And how important is real research to you when you are writing fiction? And then in brackets, real equals archival or procedural, end brackets. So are you using these index cards? I guess is the first question. Is that how you do it?
I have a lot of index cards, yeah, of various sizes. Often they get lost. It is quite chaotic. I find them in books I've been reading and so on. I actually use them a lot. I used them a lot when I was writing the exegetical component of my PhD, which focused on W.G. Zabald and his kind of topographical imagination. And so I would write out quotations from his various books. And I sometimes still do this when I'm writing a critical essay. I did it with the Luiselli essay, I think. I think I did it with the Olivia Laing essay too, but then there were just so many index cards I couldn't handle it. I had to put them aside. And so what I do then is I shuffle them around and I put them in the order that I think maybe might be good to look at this and kind of unpack that idea and then maybe move on to that. But I like it because it means I can see things kind of visually and spatially. I can see maybe how this relates to that and so on. I do a lot of kind of archival research. I spend a lot of time just looking at things, both in the archives, but also in museums and art galleries and walking, and then try and find ways to fit things together. And I suppose the other kind of procedural thing that was very important, especially with the Jealous Tide, was that, and this is something else I kind of learned from something Maureen Freely said. She mentioned at one point we must have been talking about rewriting and how different the process of rewriting is now because people work from a Word document. They just change a word here or cut and paste and move that, and how different it was when you were either working by hand or working on a typewriter. You had to rewrite literally the entire thing. And so what I would do is I'd print out I'd literally cut bits out that I wanted to move around and paste them in different ways. And then I would type it all out from the beginning again. And that was kind of rewriting process. So it is quite chaotic and it does take quite a long time. But it seems to be the way my brain works.
You got it, Sergi. So I guess it's organized chaos, the definition of organized chaos.
But you know, now it feels chaotic.
Please don't have a heart attack next time you find your stack
I'll
of
save that for
cards.
later. Yeah, off screen.
Last thing, just a coda really then. What next? What creative things are you working on, and does it involve archives?
Well, sadly it does. You know, I thought that the next thing was going to be something about Scott's Northern Party. I didn't know what. I didn't know if it was, initially I was thinking a novel, but then I thought, oh, I'll just start writing and see what happens. So I had begun reading the journals from the 6 men. So they had to overwinter in an ice cave. They had 2 weeks of supplies and then they were kind of left there for about 8 months, and all of them survived. But of course, all of those archives are in Cambridge. So I've been thinking, actually, the quick answer is I'm not working on anything at the moment. For those of you not in Melbourne, we've just come out of lockdown. My great thoughts and all power to you who've just gone back into it or who have been in it for a very long time. So this year has been very much taken up with, I'm a bookseller, so every time something changes, we need new systems and new processes, we need new ways of doing things. So that's been my year and continues to be my year. But I want to do next, I want to write something more about Teju. In fact, I want to write something at all about Teju Cole. I haven't really written about him properly. He's been important to me since I first read Open City, but this year more important than ever. I think his essays and his photographs have gotten me through 2020. So, you know, if you're struggling to be able to read or to focus on anything, get yourself a copy of Known and Strange Things and read one over your morning coffee. It helps, I assure you. But also there's something that I'd like to think about in terms of writers for whom words are not enough. He's one of them. You know, the visual is so important, working as a photographer as well. So something like that, but because I don't plan, I have no idea what it will be.
I'll second that. There was a week during the first lockdown in April where the only book I could read was Blind Spot, a little bit each day. Yep, yeah. That's what did it.
Thank
it works.
God for Teju Cole. Yeah.
I know, yes, absolutely. Well, Anna, thank you so much for the readings and for answering these questions. It has been a pleasure to see you face to face and to talk to you about your 2 wonderful books.
Thanks, Daniel. And thank you, just quickly, thank you to you and Alec and, you know, Splice for existing and for everything over the last few years. So, and to everyone who gave questions, they were great.
Yes, there were some good questions in there. I like the directness of them. Thank you, everybody who wrote in. Just as a reminder, so the 2 books are Between the Word and the World, Anna's collection of essays, and A Jealous Tide, the novel, which has just come out. If you are in Melbourne, you can go to the paperback bookshop on Burke Street and you can pick them up. Also, I think, is it Brunswick Bound and Neighbourhood Books have copies as well? Yes. You can order them. Just Brunswick Bound. Okay. Yeah. So it's on limited release in Australia. Unfortunately, it's also on limited release in Britain because bookshops in England are closed. But if you are in Scotland or Wales, you should be able to go in and request it from your bookshop if they don't have it. I know that lots of good indies do have it in stock. You can get it from the Splice website directly as well, or our new bookshop.org.uk website, not ours. Splice's, I do mean Britain's website, where you can have the book sent to your local indie and they will get a they will get a cut. So it's a way to support independent bookshops, even though you are buying it online, which really helps when their doors are closed south of the border of where I am. Thank you once again, Anna. And
Thanks, Daniel.
thank you everyone for watching and supporting Splice and these two books.